All right, everyone. My name is Pete Scazzero. I want to welcome you today to the Emotionally Healthy Leader podcast. I'm going to share with you a message that we will call Palace or Cave, Where True Power Resides. Palace or Cave, Where True Power Resides. Why did God put Jesus and Herod on the world stage at the same time? He was trying to teach us something, really, what Christmas actually is all about. I mean, you've got the contrast of Bethlehem and Jesus being born in this small village of 100 to 300 people in a cave, actually, a manger, we say, and, overpowering smell, not very pretty. And in contrast, we've got Herod living in one of the biggest palaces in the world with all the comfort, power, and glory, not far away from that place. And God's drawing an extreme picture for us about true power, that things are not as they appear to be. So you're going to hear a lot of interesting data in this message about Herod in particular, contrasting it with Jesus. Now, this material came from two sources. One is, at that time, Jerry took, around that time, a trip with Ray Vander Laan, out of, some of you are familiar with his name. He's got a ministry called That the World May Know, and she took a trip to Israel for a couple of weeks with him and a larger group, and really got deep into the background of first century Judaism and the world at that time. And so she came back with some insights, and then it caused me to pull back and remember a course that I took at Harvard Divinity School. The seminary I was at had a partnership with Harvard. And so I took a course there on the history, culture, and religion in the Hellenistic age with a world scholar named Helmut Kester, K-O-E-S-T-E-R, the world scholar in first century Roman Empire, culture, economics, society, politics. And we looked at the Roman Empire and all its different provinces and religions. And of course, we studied Herod the Great. Enjoy this message on Palace or Cave, Where True Power Resides.
So Matthew chapter 2, and I'd like to begin reading at verse 1. I read a study that said that if you don't do something with what you hear in the next 48 to 72 hours, that this message will just have been a lot of nice ideas. Well, that's pretty humbling for someone like myself, who speaks every week here, that if you, or myself, because this message has really hit me quite hard in thinking about Christmas, if I don't do something differently in the next 48 to 72 hours, then I will probably forget everything I heard, and I'll just heard a lot of clever, cute ideas. So I had to pray that God would do some wonderful thing, that something would happen in all of our Christmases as a result of what you hear today from this passage. And I'm working on me first. So let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for that promise in Jeremiah 33:3, that call on me and I will show you great and unsearchable things that you know not. So Lord, we call on you today that we could somehow, Father, be delivered from the culture in which we live that so seeks to suck your life out of us, that we lose you in the midst of the time of year when we should most be focusing and centering on you. So I pray, Lord, you would help us today to hear a new thing from you, and most importantly, that we would be able to actually walk this out differently, somehow, each one of us in our own unique settings in the next 48 to 72 hours. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, chapter 2, verse 1 of this famous story of Matthew. And I want you to focus on Herod here as we go along. And the question I'm going to ask you is why did God put Jesus, his son, to be born at the same time of Herod? They were both on the stage, the world stage, at the same time. And it's because I believe very much that God was trying to teach us something. And there was a message in here for all of us about Christmas and our lives. And we were meant to read this passage and note a sharp contrast of Herod the king with Jesus the king. So, beginning at verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod. Very important. During the time of King Herod. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east, and in the east and come to worship him. And when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written, and it gives the prophecy. Verse 7, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child, and as soon as you find him, report to me so I may go and worship him. And then you know the rest of the story. Verse 16, moving down there, he realizes he'd been outwitted by the Magi. He's furious. He gives orders to kill all the boys in Jerusalem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So I want to begin this morning by just talking to you a little bit about Herod and then about Jesus. And I want you to think of the contrast, how they're both very, very different. And then I want to make simply two applications of where I think it's meant for us today. There's so much here that I'm going to have to finish it next week. But I want to just give you two for this morning to think about for Christmas. Now, Herod was literally called the king of the Jews. That was his job. And so when it says in verse 1, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judah during the time of King Herod, that meant a lot to the people who read that verse in the days of Jesus. He was the king of the Jews for 37 years. Through a variety of means of conspiracy and intrigue, he'd gotten himself in a great position with the Roman Caesar and had set himself up as king of the Jews in Judea. And he was really the greatest king the Mideast had ever known, outside of David and Solomon. He was half a Jew. He was what's called an Edomite or a Edomian. And he was Edomites were descendants of, remember Jacob and Esau? Descendants of Esau. So he was half a Jew. And he married into a royal Jewish family and was deeply in love with his first wife called Marianne, or Marini. But as a king of the Jews, he had a reputation, a big reputation, far and wide, as being very ruthless and cruel. He was jealous, he was suspicious, he was very afraid. In fact, as his life moved on, by the end of his 37-year reign, he was really crazy and very afraid of losing his power and position. And he was considered crazy and neurotic really throughout his life. So, for example, early on, when he first took power, he killed thousands of Jews that were a threat to him. When he was threatened by the high priest of the Sanhedrin, he simply drowned him. He was afraid of his wife's brother, perhaps trying to get him overthrown, so he assassinated him. He loved his wife so much, he was so obsessed with her, lest anything else happen to her, he killed her. And he was afraid also that maybe she was plotting against him, which was all so far from the truth. Then he had they had two oldest sons who he was also afraid that maybe they would plot to overthrow him because they would want the throne before he died, so he killed them also. And 5 days before his death, he killed his third oldest son, knowing that his son wanted the throne. In fact, Augustus Caesar, who was the head of the entire Roman Empire, wrote this about Herod. I would rather be Herod's swine or pig than his family, for pigs have a better chance of living. Now, history records that Herod killed tens of thousands of people during his reign, that he killed tens of thousands of the best men and women in the nation out of fear they'd rise up against him. And some estimates of some scholars say he killed in his 37-year reign 1 million people. Now, they say scarcely a day passed of his 37 years that he did not execute somebody. Have you ever heard of a book called The Source by James Mitchner? He's a novelist who writes historical fiction. And his old story gives us a picture of what happened, what life was like under Herod's reign if you were living there. A woman was getting her hair curled by slaves. And she made a comment about these massacres of Herod. And a maid who listened in and reported her, and then she was put to torture until she gave the name of her accomplices, of which she then gave 60, and they had nothing to do with anything. There was no plot. And these 60 were then brought in, and they were tortured to the death on the rack until they implicated hundreds of more. So all of these were slain without a trail for a crime that had not even been considered or named. Their wealth went to the king, for their families were all killed, even to the babies. And that was what life was like. Have you ever read The Gulag by Alexander Solzhenitsyn? And you read about what life was like under Stalin in the 1930s in the former Soviet Union. That's what life was like in Palestine when Jesus was born. and where the political climate, there were spies everywhere. There were no public gatherings at that time that would not be considered seditious or rebellious. But the Romans liked Herod the Great because, and they allowed this madman to reign for 37 years because he kept order. He kept peace on the frontiers of the empire, and he was deeply loyal to Rome. And he supported their interests. In fact, before he died, he realized he was so hated by the Jews. So what he did was, he died a horrible death, by the way, but he wanted to be grieved and mourned at his death. And he knew they weren't going to mourn, they were going to celebrate. So what he did was he had all the leading Jews of the nation rounded up, and he put them in jail. And he commanded his soldiers, and he had mercenaries from Africa and different parts of Asia and Germany and Persians. He had this great mercenary army. And he said, listen, the moment I die, I want you to kill all these Jews so that at least the country will mourn on the day of my death. But fortunately, they didn't do it when he died, which was good news. But you can imagine when he hears in this story, now with that little backdrop, chapter 2, verse 1, you can imagine when he hears these magi show up at his palace and says, hey, where's the king of the Jews? And you can imagine why he went crazy when in verse 16, 18, when he goes to Bethlehem and kills every baby under 2, that was nothing unusual. That was just the normal run of operations for King Herod. And but there's a good, well, not good side, but there's another side to Herod. He's a very complex figure in history and fascinating because as a king, in the Mideast, he led Israel on building programs unlike any other, including Solomon. I mean, he built palaces and fortresses. Now, he built these fortresses that were massive, that to this day, if you go to Israel on a trip, they will show you a number of Herod's palaces and fortresses and temples, because he had armies and armies of slaves that cut out stones. And he had a particular way that he had the stones cut for his architecture that were called Herodian. But he built gigantic fortresses for his own security from his friends, from his enemies, and he had these lavish palaces. Now, Caesar had 1 palace. Herod had 9. And so for 37 years, he embarked on a massive building program. Now, some of you know, and I think it was, I don't know, Peter Gluss is here, he gave me when he studied the history of New York, he gave me a book on Robert Moses. You ever heard of Robert Moses? He was one of the great builders in New York City history, and he was responsible for these highways that cut through neighborhoods. Could you imagine what it would take to build the Cross Bronx and just cut through neighborhoods? Or the Van Wyck Expressway and just divide up ethnic neighborhoods. And he was ruthless. He's responsible for all this incredible system we've got here. It's quite amazing. But this guy was Robert Moses 100 times over. And so, for example, he built entire cities. So he built, you heard of the city, Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea. And he built it, he named it for Caesar. And it was a magnificent city. He built the largest harbor in that place in all the world. It was actually 260 acres into the sea. And he built a theater at Caesarea that seated 4,000 people. He had a 25-acre palace that went 24 stories high. He had a huge temple to the gods. He had a lighthouse. He had a stadium for horses and for the Olympic Games. And it was an amazing feat that he built this city, Caesarea, that was so magnificent in honor of Caesar in the middle of Israel, which was a monotheistic, nationalistic people. And he was very shrewd politically. He built Masada. You heard of Masada? At least you saw the movie. All right, way up there in the mountain. He built Masada. It was one of his many, many fortresses. And all of his fortresses and swimming pools, all his fortresses and palaces, he loved swimming pools, had lots of swimming pools. And he built up Jerusalem. He's the one responsible for what's called the temple, Herodian temple, the Wailing Wall. You've seen that, right? Many of you have been there and seen pictures. But that was the foundation of his temple. But this temple that he built for the Jews to keep them happy and all that was 2 times bigger than any temple on all the earth. And it took many, many years to build. I mean, one stone, the stones there weighed 650 tons. Now, if my math is correct, that's 130,000 pounds. Now, these stones were put up 30 to 40 feet above the wall. I mean, he somehow got these slaves to get these stones up there. I mean, I'm trying to work on lifting 118 pounds on my bench press, and I'm 130,000 pounds. I mean, the size was astounding of the stones and this temple that he built, and it towered over the city. If you've seen pictures of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, that temple area just dominated Jerusalem at the time, and he built it. In the process, he did something we call Hellenizing Jerusalem. I mean, he wanted to make the Jews happy, but he was very committed to a lifestyle that we would call Hellenistic or worldly. It went back hundreds of years to the whole Greek culture, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But he was very pro-Roman, very Greek in his lifestyle, and he was an Edomite, which is a half-Jew, and the Jews hated him for all three of those reasons. Now, the key thing that Read the Christmas Story right is he built, of his many, many palaces, he had 9, he built his biggest one only a few miles from Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem was a small town of 100 to 300 people. And he built his biggest palace a few miles away. And before he built the palace, the first thing he did was he literally had a mountain moved, because he liked his palaces high, so he could see everything that was going on. So first he moved a mountain. Then now that makes sense, that verse when Jesus says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. Herod would move mountains. But Jesus said, no, prayer will move mountains, says Jesus. So he moves a mountain and he builds this massive palace, which went 22 stories up. Now, his palace areas had apartment complexes and everything. I mean, they were just gigantic. And when the wise men went looking for him, and here in chapter 2, they probably went to that palace right next to Bethlehem to see him. Now, what he had was this guy had vision. He had wealth, he had power, and he sustained that vision and building for 37 years. But it made him strong, it made him famous, and of course it made him feel very, very safe during that time. And finally is this, he was considered, at that time, he was considered the richest man on the earth at that time. And one of the big questions has always been, where did he get the money for all these massive building projects? Because everything is inlaid with gold and these beautiful mosaic and frescoes, and say, where did this guy get the money for this? It was so phenomenal because, yes, he did prosper the economy and he did pillage and rape the money off the Jewish people, but the kind of money he spent was far, far beyond that. And one historian writes that he was the richest man that has ever lived, if you put it in dollars of today, that he had created an aphrodisiac, kind of like a Viagra of today. And he sold this all over the world to the Romans and the Greeks. And that he had a secret operation going where if anybody told anybody how he made this, of course, that was the end of them. So they were sworn to secrecy, and he had the only rights on this thing, and it was worldwide. And that's where one scholar believes that's where all of his wealth came from, this aphrodisiac that he created over his 37-year period. Very interesting, But he had limitless funds here for his building and limitless power. Now, here's the key thing I want you to see. Here's Herod. Now, God placed Jesus on the world stage at the exact same time as Herod, only a few miles away in Bethlehem. So here's Herod, king of the Jews, on one side in his palace with all of his comfort and glory and power. And here's Jesus born in Bethlehem, a little town of 100 to 300 people, and in a manger. Now, a manger in those days, it was placed in either a stable or a small cave in the countryside. Now, these were not, we dress up, we don't have a manger here today, but we dress up our mangers with a little hay, and the animals are nice and clean. But mangers are, again, they were placed in caves primarily for protection, and these were dirty, smelly places. These were not sanitary places. This was the bottom. And here's Jesus, king of the Jews, born basically in a cave, a dirty, small, dark cave. And can you imagine, just try to imagine Mary and Joseph and the shepherds walking past that palace of Herod on this mountain, this massive palace that's magnificent. There's the king of the Jews. And walking past that and going to this cave in which is born this little baby. That's the Messiah. That's king of the Jews. Can you appreciate the kind of faith it took to believe that this was the king of the Jews? For the shepherds to come and worship him? An act of total rebellion. Your life is in your hands. I mean, what faith? But here's the Messiah, weak, small, and vulnerable. And here is Herod, powerful, glorious, comfort in one of the biggest palaces of the world with all that goes with it. So here's power at its top and weakness at its top and at its most. And here's God, in a sense, drawing for us an extreme picture of Herod, worldly power, and weakness at its extreme over here. And we look at them both at the same time. And God says, this weakness, this baby is the way of salvation. It's not over here. Now, God says Herod is not the king. Jesus is the king. And now, who believed it? Not a lot of people in those days believed it, that Jesus was the king. Most did not. They believed that Herod was the king. And but God chose to put the king of the universe not in the palace, but in the cave. Dirty, small, and dark. Now, what are two messages? There's a lot of messages in this. In fact, it's so overwhelming that it's hard to even know what to do with that truth. If I just said you just think about this for a while, what does this mean for us that God chose to do it this way? So I'm going to give you two things, and briefly, just go on down. The first one is, I think there's a command application for us to see clearly that things are not as they appear to be. That we're to see clearly in life. Mary, the shepherds, the magi, they saw clearly. Things were not as they appeared to be. It appeared that Herod was the real king. He was not the real king. It looked like he was reigning high and ruling. He was not. Now, I think of myself, where would I rather be, the palace or the cave? I can tell you, I choose the palace any day. But that was the choice, the palace or the cave. And God says things are not as they appear to be. Life is in the cave, not the palace. Don't go running after that. Now, this came out not immediately, but in longevity and long term. If you read Herod's life, by the end of his life, he died a horrible, horrible death. He was a miserable man. He was consumed with controlling people, consumed with jealousy. Pathological liar. He was a lot like Stalin. But Romans chapter 1 talks about how when we reject God's revelation, he resists grace. He resists any revelation from God here. And his life just goes down, 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 down. And when you resist revelation, you start wrecking people around you. And he destroyed a lot of people. But by the end of his life, God has given him over, and he is a mess. But we look at Herod down the road, things don't go too well. And you know what he's remembered for? You ask people, what do you remember Herod for? People will say to you, he killed a lot of babies. That's what we remember him for. You go to Israel, you'll see a lot of his ruins. And archaeologists and tour guides will show you, oh, he had a palace over here, and here's the temple, here's another palace over here, and here's Caesarea, and here's the great theater, here's a stadium, and here's where the horses stayed. And they'll show you these incredible feats. Masada, how did he ever get the swimming pool up here? They are feats that to this day engineers marvel at how he ever accomplished his building feats. But what we remember about Herod now is everything was not as they appear to be, and everything he's got is in ruins. Jesus, on the other hand, he owned nothing. He built nothing, physical anyway. He died naked and poor, and he was crucified between two thieves. And yet today, things are not as they seem. Jesus has millions and millions and millions of followers and fills the universe with his power and reigns on high and is resurrected at the right hand of the Father. And he is the glorious one, but it didn't appear that way at first at all. And it took a great deal of faith to believe that what God said was true and to follow that in the first Christmas. And you know what? It takes as much faith to follow Jesus today and go to the small, dirty place of the cave and not go our world's way, which is the palace. I was at Walmart yesterday. I almost got run over by a shopping cart. It was a madhouse. I said, where is God in all of this? I don't know. I was just trying to buy a toy. But life is a vapor. And you want to step back and look at this verse 1, when they go to, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, you stop and say, wow, all the wealth, all the power, all the glory, all the fame, all the education, it all came to nothing. It was meaningless. Life is like a vapor, says James, like a mist. It's here and it's gone. And that's why we're not to be seduced, the Bible says, by what's going on around us, by what the Bible calls the world. And John the Apostle wrote this in 1 John 2:15. I wrote it down here. Rather than you turn to it, it says, do not love the world or anything in it. And if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. And the world and its desires pass away. But the man or woman who does the will of God lives forever. And when you get to eternity, the end of your life, how will you look back at your life, really, in terms of how you invested it? And I want to invite you to take a look around you. We live in the most prosperous nation on earth, and it's a gift. I love America. It's a great country. But we have to look at all the serious temptations that come with living in America. Because it's a palace here, this nation. And we buy things that we don't need for people we don't like with money we don't have, And we're under tremendous pressure at Christmas. And I want to ask you, really, things are not as they appear to be. And where are you this Christmas, really? Are you in the palace with Herod? Or are you in the cave with Jesus? Which brings me to my second point, which kind of builds on the first one, which is you've got to choose which king you will serve and follow, Herod or Jesus. Now, I'm a little convicted by this because my wife has slowed down, and as she said, I've speeded up. But you'll read the expression in the New Testament called the Herodians all over the place. And Herodians were Jewish people who had assimilated to the culture of the pagans. And Herod had a few sons. He put them in charge after he died. But there were Jewish people called Herodians, and these were believers who were kind of like they were Jewish, but they lived like everybody else. They were believers in God, but their lifestyle was Greek. And the worldview of the Roman Empire, I guess the worldview when Herod was king was Greek. It was Hellenism. It was when Alexander the Great had come in hundreds of years earlier, he had established the Greek culture in the arts, in music, in sports, in education, in religion. And the empire was thoroughly Greek, the Roman Empire. And it was better, big, more, better. It was Fortune magazine, Wall Street Journal. It was the worldview is truth is whatever works for you. Yes, the God of Israel, but also, we want ISIS, and we want to make sure we got the other gods and the pantheons, and, we got everybody. We want to make sure all bases are covered. And true is whatever's true for you, and human pleasure is the goal in life. And basically, it was all about image and beauty and looking good, and your worth is based on what you do. And what's important is your five senses, what you feel, touch, and see, and pleasure. Life is about pleasure. That was the Greek worldview, and that was where Herod was at. It was about comfort and powerful and making money and moving up the ladder. And they were bombarded in that culture with this from every direction. All the schools taught it. And so here are these Jewish believers trying to walk out their faith in the middle of this life under Herod the Great, under a culture that's overwhelming. And you got to imagine, and they have the internet, schools, internet, newspapers, all pushing this worldview. But in the first century, there were believers struggling to serve the true and living God. And they said they're going to do life differently. And we got to ask ourselves the question, how are we going to do life now at Christmas here? Living in New York City in 2001, how do we do this? Living, in a sense, under Herod the Great, the culture of America, which sucks us in to such an extent that, let's face it, for many of us, Christmas time, our spiritual life takes a major nosedive. And it is so difficult to maintain balance, let alone draw closer to God and lift Him up. And our lifestyle, really, we're like the Herodians. We're believe, but really we live like everybody else. And we have to ask ourselves the question, are we really distinct from the world around us? And I will raise my hand, number one, in recognizing that in the next 48 to 72 hours, I've got to make some serious changes. Now, there's two things they were committed to as early believers in the first century, to be able to choose Jesus as king and not Herod. And first is that if you were a believer in God, you were absolutely, I didn't write it down, I ran out of space in my overhead. Okay, number one, there was an absolute commitment to God in every area of life. You understand, when a person was a believer in the time of Herod, in Jesus, whether you're shepherds or magi or Mary or Joseph, and even the early Christians and the Jewish people living in the times of Herod, there was an absolute, total commitment to God as first priority over everything in life. Over job, over career, over parents' expectations, over societal expectations. God was first. There was no question about that, or else you would get swallowed up. And so the spiritual disciplines were life and death for early believers. And for Jewish believers in the time of Jesus, they couldn't imagine saying, you know what, prayer, they prayed 5 times a day, they couldn't imagine dropping, you know what, I got to go shopping. They couldn't even imagine such a lifestyle. And I'm going to drop out of God for a while. Prayer, the discipline of the word, the discipline of Sabbath. I mean, these things for believers were not even like, they were never in question for them, because they understood that to survive in that kind of a culture, there was such a warfare going on that there was a total commitment that my life is God. But then there was a second thing, which I didn't write down, which was a commitment to radical community. Remember the word insula? Remember the series on James? I kept bringing you the word insula. That was the Greek word for living in community. And they've done excavations. The believers in this day, they knew there was no way they could survive under Herod the Great or under this Hellenized Greek world and follow God unless they lived in community. There was no way they ever dreamed they could resist the pressures around them except they were living together. And so they have excavations of neighborhoods, of insulas, of where the Jewish people lived and where everybody else lived. And if you look at the architecture of the houses, they're totally different. The Herodians and the rest of the culture had huge houses and baths and not all the people, but the architecture is very different. While the homes and the houses of the Jews did not have all those things. I mean, they didn't have the 57-inch TV, or the big baths, or the ornate mosaics and the wealthy gold inlaid columns. But they were very different because they understood they had to live, first, absolutely committed to God, but second, they had to live in community or else they'll never make it. Do you know what? There is no way I can live out Christmas differently unless there's a body of people, believers, questioning the way the culture is doing Christmas. It's too powerful. My children alone are enough pressure to overwhelm me. And so I think most of us are Herodians in the way that we celebrate Christmas and the way that we live our lives. Who has time for God or really needy people at Christmas? I'm just too busy. And to the question is, I want to choose Jesus as my king during Christmas. And I know I've got to, it starts with reestablishing the way I think, but things are not as they appear to be. Things are not the way it looks out there about what's really going on, what's really important. But secondly, I want Jesus to be my king at Christmas. And you know what? He's in a cave, which is small, dark, and dirty. And I want to choose the cave and not the palace. So I've got to ask myself some hard questions. I want to ask you the questions. And that is, how does, for example, buying gifts for my children fit into this being Jesus' birthday? I'm not saying we shouldn't buy gifts for our children, but I have to ask myself the question, how does it fit in to the fact this is Christ's birthday here? And how do I lead them into that understanding? How do I do Christmas Jesus' way? I can't tell you. You've got to work that out for yourself. I got to work it out for myself. But I know one thing. I don't want to do Christmas Herod's way. And we as a community don't want to do it Herod's way. We want to somehow figure out what it means to do it Jesus' way. And I know one thing. That for Jesus' way, if any time of the year, we should be about the least of these, which Jesus talks about. True salvation works it out in showing love to those who are the least. I don't think being super busy, being in debt, spending money like crazy is what this is all about. I think Christmas is really about acts of service to the least of these. I'm talking about inviting the elderly over for dinner, the sick, the prisoner, the dying. Remember, Jesus said the great ones in the kingdom are the unimpressive ones, those in the shadows, the insignificant, the children, the poor, not the flamboyant, the battered, the handicapped, the prisoners, the lonely, the socially unstrategic. That this is what Christmas is about. I'm raising my hand. I've had a busy couple of weeks. And I've missed it so far. I have. I'm aware that I have missed it. And so it was kind of hard to get up here and preach when I'm having a Herodian Christmas. But I want Jesus as my king this Christmas. So I am making some changes. I made a couple last night. And it's true what God said. It is truly greater to give than it is to receive, to give joy to people. And I want to invite you this morning to pause for a moment and ask yourself, which king am I going to serve and follow this Christmas? Herod or Jesus? And for those of us who have children, if you don't have children, we've got to lead our children to what Christmas is all about, because the culture is overwhelming them. And we've got to stop and pause and get a grip. And I'm the first one repenting on this one. All right. Amen.